Welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's Community Talk Show. I'm Wendy O'Connell. We're back with you today. Our guest today is Mara Williams. Mara has been the art beat of the Brattleboro Museum Art Center here in town for over 30 years. She served as curator of exhibits, executive director, chief curator, and sometimes all of these at once. Mara is passionate about arts and artists, community, and life in general, and her passion inspires us all. She will be stepping down as BMAC's chief curator at the end of the year, but she's going to be stepping up to some new adventures that she's going to talk to us about. Welcome, Mara.
It's so good to be with you, my friend, and see you here in a studio instead of in the back room of the museum doing some cataloging work for us.
Or something like that. Yes, yes, it's good to be with you too, Mara. I'm glad you're on. And we're catching you before you leave your post, even though I know you're going to be staying on in different capacities, which we're going to hear about. As you were telling me, you're from a big family in Dorchester, right outside of Boston. And it sounded like you had a really interesting and kind of wonderful upbringing. There was theater, there were arts, there was opera singers, you know, all kinds of things, and brothers and sisters.
It was a big raucous family, and it was a theater family and an arts family in general, from all different sides. It's actually interesting because my grandfather's sister ran away from the farm in Maine as a 14-year-old, and then she joined with Florence Ziegfeld in his first set of follies in 1910, and she was what they call a pony dancer. I mean, she wasn't 5 feet tall, so not the big tall showgirls that eventually in the 20s and 30s became the standard and is still the Las Vegas standard of a showgirl, but the little pony dancer. She then went on tour with DeWitt Hopper and the Big Old. I have pictures signed to her from Rudolph Valentino, from Mae West, from W.C. Fields. And her nephew, my dad, was the theater director. And her sister-in-law, my grandmother, was a songbird, and she sang with the big bands of the 20s and 30s. And then on the Italian side of the family, they were calligraphers, specially trained in Italy calligraphers, and later became sign painters when you would go up and you'd paint a 20-foot, 40-foot billboard, 7 stories, 12 stories in the air. So that was what some of my great uncles. And we had professional artists on my mother's side, class of 1919 from Mass College of Art. So it was all a mishmash.
Yeah.
My mother was the scientist in the group, however.
Interesting.
and Mom and Dad had 7 children. And we were all backstage at all my dad's theater productions. And then when we moved to Cape Cod, Dad gave up his career to move us to Cape Cod in the late 1960s. And he became active in community theater and historic preservation as his sort of avocation. And we all just fell into the theater department and the art department at Barnstable High School in Hyannis, Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah. You learned backstage stuff from the get-go, so you were very comfortable in that situation. And were you kids also on the stage during that time?
Some of the children were, and others of us were the backstage people, and some were both. I mean, my brother Scott was equally comfortable on stage or running a follow spot. He was just enormously talented. I was always more comfortable being either a stage manager or a designer.
Oh, really? Well, I would think you would be on the stage. I could see you doing that.
No, it's to be a really good actor, there's so much of yourself internally that you have to be willing to make naked in front of an audience, kind of like a painter. I'm much better at looking at work, assessing work, talking about work, drawing people into the aesthetic experience. My approach has always been very collaborative with my colleagues, with the artists that I'm working with the head of education. It's an all-team effort.
Well, that might come from having a large family as well, collaborating with your brothers and sisters.
We were taught to get along to go along.
That's a good phrase. There's one story you told me that I thought was really wonderful about your summers and how you kids spent your summers on the Cape before you moved down.
They were magical. We were out for many years. We had a month in Nickerson State Park right beside a kettle pond in these pine forests that still, sometimes I walk into a forest and that's that right mix of The ocean is in the air, but the real scent is the pine and the sand-dirt combination that is in a kettle pond.
Yeah.
And I'm just immediately transported to Brewster, Massachusetts, and I'm immediately 5 years old again.
Yes.
It's marvelous.
Yeah, so you kids got to stay there, and then the parents would come down for 2 weeks.
And the grandparents would come down for
Yeah.
2 weeks. Would all be brought down in
Yeah.
the station wagon, and then Mom and Dad would disappear for 2 weeks. And then they would come back, and my grandmother would disappear for 2 weeks, and Mom and Dad would be with us.
Yeah.
And there was one summer that Mom and Dad disappeared, and when they came back, there was the fourth baby.
Magic!
Magic! And my brother Gordon arrived on the scene, the most beautiful baby ever.
So you go on to a Jesuit college.
I did.
And you were studying liberal arts?
It was a liberal arts program, but I was a theater major. And within that liberal arts tradition, where I did go on stage, because you had to go on stage, I
Right.
did take acting classes,
Yeah.
but I took design classes. I also took philosophy classes, theology classes.
Yeah. Theater was sort of always in the background. You were kind of always doing theater.
I was doing theater. I did junior year abroad at the Tufts in London program, where I was studying at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I was studying at English National Opera. I was working in the costume shop at English National Opera. I was doing all my Victorian design classes. It was always to inform my theater design work. And even when I got to Boston, and I was my first job was the operations director at the Institute for Contemporary Art. So I started both designing and stage managing for several of the artists who were part of the Institute's dance team, and I was running the operations of that particular program. And I was taking classes at night to further inform my design, and that's when really the crossover started into the visual arts primarily, and into sort of my more academic look at what is the aesthetic moment, what are the structures, what ideas cut across disciplines, so dance to theater to design to so a theater designer is trained one way, but an artist who designs for a performer like Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and Andy Warhol for Merce Cunningham come in from a completely different point of view. It was mind-boggling for me as a 19, 20-year-old to see the Merce Cunningham Company on tour in Boston, and it just, all my classical training just flew out the window in an instance. And I was like, wow, so this is the contemporary moment.
Yes.
Really
Well,
cool.
that was a real turning point
It was.
in art and design and dance and theater and everything.
It was.
And so you were able to kind of hinge those things together, however, and bring them into what you were really interested in.
I ended up at Syracuse University in their curatorial studies program.
Yes.
So, big difference.
Yes, and so that widened your whole field.
At Syracuse, I did budget, finance, and development for
right.
nonprofits, so that when I came to Brattleboro, I was really a triple threat. I had the nonprofit business and grant writing and solicitation background. I had the technical production background for a staff that was non-existent, to be perfectly honest with you. And then I had my, my bona fides in terms of looking at art and talking about art, writing about art, and working with living artists.
So you brought all this to Brattleboro. How was Brattleboro so lucky to get you?
My college roommate married somebody else's college roommate, and he was on the board of the Brattleboro Museum Art Center. So he had met me shortly after I got out of undergraduate, and now it's 5-6 years later or something like that. And he starts recruiting me for this job. For almost a year, he wrangled me, and finally he stuck Kathy down on me. She's like the greatest salesperson in America. She told me all about this town and why this museum was important and how I had to take it from where it is here to there, and all the things that you're interested in, you will be free to do here. And we have a co-op, and did you know we have Wolf Kahn and Emily Mason here? And I'm like, seriously? When they stuck the charming Wolf on me, who eventually brought me to Hamelman's and to Delectable Mountain, and then over to meet Emily at the co-op, and then she sat with me for a while, and I'm like, they seem to really care that this institution does well. And I still was having a hard time making that leap of faith and to think that this was the right institution, because it had some problems. a lot of problems. And, finally, it was one of my undergraduate friends who was also in New York at the time who just sat me down and said, Mara, you've trained your whole life to take a non-collecting institution that's pretty much going to let you do anything you want and pretty much let you decide how you're going to write about art to real people. You don't have to continue. You hate writing footnotes to other scholars, Mara. Every time you have to write a paper for one of those PhD things you're doing, you bitch and moan the whole time. What the hell has this got to do with art? This only has something to do with art history, blah, 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 blah. And he said, Mara, you've always said you'd go for your first job wherever it was, as long as it wasn't Biloxi, Mississippi. Well, you'll be back in New England. And I went, yeah, right. And so I came up here, and the rest is kismet.
How old were you then?
33.
33. So 33 years old to have sort of that amazing ability to
No
expand.
one in my age group had a director curatorship where they were given free rein. No one.
Yeah.
I was probably the youngest director in New England, period, and no one had the portfolio that I had and the trust that I had.
Because this was 90s?
It was
80s.
1989. It was the
89.
fall of 89.
Yeah, right.
And I got here, and within 3 months, I knocked on the board's door and said, you're 6 months away from bankruptcy. The books you showed me before I came here, it's not really what's happening here.
Yeah.
And what are we going to do? And the wonderful Donna Borofsky, supported by her husband backing us and guaranteeing lines of credit for us. The incredible Fred Moriarty, who was with Holstein at the time. Then he opened his own business. He came back to us for a few years. He was CFO of the Holstein Association, and he just knew what to do. He knew what to do. And then Cecile French and Judy and Roger Miller. That was the core team that got us through those first few years that I was here. That restructured the institution, reestablished our connections to members of the community who had fallen by the wayside, reestablished connections to former trustees like Aldi Gannett, then Bob Gannett, and George Heller, the great George Heller. They and Wolf and Emily's incredible moral and financial backing.
Yes.
That's the core dozen people who surrounded me and said, show us how we do this, and we'll back you up on it. And they did, and they did, and they turned the whole place around. We got some younger people involved who are now my seniors. People like Stephen Phillips got involved, and Valerie Stewart got involved, and Carolyn D. Nicola Foley got involved. So the people in my peer group, Lucy McVitie Weber, who was on this side of the river in those days, she's over in Walpole now, but Lucy came on board. So there was this whole group of 30-somethings who came in with this whole group of 60-somethings, and between the two of us, we got it going, and it became relevant to all of these different age constituencies.
Yes, and a lot of that's happening right now in Brattleboro as well, bringing the different age groups together, the people who are in their 30s and 40s and the people who are in their 60s and 70s, collaborating, coming together and sharing things. There's so many things that I know that you do as a curator and you've done over the years. What do you really love about that job?
I love working with artists. Like just going to an artist studio, whether it's you're in Manhattan on the Lower East Side, and you walk down an alley, and then you walk down a staircase, you go by 15 pipes, and you get into a room the size of this studio, and they're working large, and they're pulling the canvases out, and you're like this, or they're putting them on the floor for you, or you're going to an eminent artist's large studio, and you're talking to somebody who's actually in the art history books, and you're asking Red Grooms or Emily Mason or the dealers who are working with Jim Dine to borrow sort of really important work by really important artists. To the little Brattleboro Museum and Art Center in an old-fashioned train station. And to a person, whether it's the dealer, the artist themselves, the children of the artist, or the representative of the artist, and whether it's a young, fresh out of grad school artist, or it is Mr. Grooms, how incredibly generous of their time and of their talent, with people like Wolf and Emily, of their treasure, how incredibly generous they are to somebody who genuinely loves their work.
Right, right. And you know, the other piece of it too, I think, is that we all have a certain mystique about artist studios, and so to be able to, as you described so beautifully, you know, you're walking into a different world, kind of, and the creativity, the amount of creativity that takes place there.
It's magical. I always look for their wall of inspiration, and you know, and sometimes there are artists who have the means, and there's a real Picasso on the wall, you know, and there's a little painting by somebody else on the wall. And there's a postcard tacked up. And for others, it's just postcards all over the place. There's a Giacometti there, and there's a Cimabue there, and there's a Mark Rothko there, and there's a Frida Kahlo there. And it gives you an idea of what their visual interest is. There might be a bough of oak leaves that changed in a particularly interesting way that they put up, or a piece of kelp, or you know, you just a geode, or sometimes it's Pantone, you know, just Pantone strips, so that they're obviously thinking that color has to be in relationship to this color.
Yes. Mara, with you stepping down this year, and I know you're not stepping too far away, you're going to be holding on to a few things. And you also have come up with a new curatorial model at BMAC, something that's a little bit different. Could you talk a little bit about those things?
Okay. Well, this is something that Danny and my colleague Sarah and I have talked about for several years, as knowing I was getting older and knowing my energy level is just not what it was when I was 33 years old. And so I've prided myself on showing a diverse range of artwork. From representational to completely conceptual, from oil to multimedia, from immersive installations to easel-size painting, balancing artists of this generation with artists of that generation, balancing regional artists whose work deserves exposure in a museum to internationally famous artists, balancing male to female, bringing in artists of other cultures or from minority communities. As I like to say, my taste and perspective in curating is very Catholic and never parochial.
Yes.
So, you know, so I'm interested, you know, I meet people, I meet artists, I meet someone who says, do you know that my sister's roommate is an artist? You should look at the work, it's wild. And I look at the work and it's wild, but not particularly well executed, or it's wild and fantastic, and I want to work with that person. But I've really moved myself within the budget constraints of the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center and the shipping constraints of the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. I really have shown a diverse, dynamic series of art and artists. If we want to have a diverse curatorial perspective, and we want to have a younger curatorial perspective, because we want to know what the kids are finding interesting today, or what the 30-year-olds, I mean, the 30-year-olds are kids now, are finding interesting today, then we need to go out after more and different guest curators, and we have to put more money in the budget for guest curators. Given what the discussion has been in our larger national conversation about race and equity and access, then we need to change the curatorial perspective here so that a Latinx gay man can do something, and an African American woman of Caribbean culture can do something, or an African American woman who came from, you know, slave generations, which is going to be, they're different one from the other. It's different life experiences, it's different lived experiences. They are parts of different artistic communities, and particularly the whole age thing. So Sarah's much younger than I am.
And so Sarah Freeman is going to be stepping in.
But Sarah and I chose the guest curators who are doing work for us last year and next year together. She's always been managing us.
Yeah.
Me too. She manages me.
She's pretty terrific.
Like, oh my goodness,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
dare miss a deadline anymore. I used to miss deadlines left, right, and center. Now I only miss them to the right. But she will, but it will be her artistic perspective. She may not curate as much as I did, but she will be asking people to curate, propose curatorial projects.
Yes.
If they, and then how they all interlock and fit together with the matrix that we use. She's going to orchestrate it. She's
great.
stepping up to the podium, and I'm stepping off the podium.
Yes. Something that I always appreciate, Mara, in going to a show at the museum, especially if it's a show that you've curated and it's a single artist. There's always a nice write-up that's right there next to the wall. And I've got to say that there's a lot of art speak, so to speak, that can be very incomprehensible. But I've always very much admired the way that you've been able to capture whoever the person is and to tease out all of the things that make that person individual and unique, and also help in the way you write to show us what that person, that artist, is trying to bring forth, and which also touches our own levels of creativity too.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pride and joy. And it is how I write about art. I hope to write like a really, really, really wonderful op-ed writer. That in somewhere between 125 words and 800 words, I can distill the wonderful qualities that open up aesthetic expression in the body of work that I'm showing. And I want to do it in a way that the lifelong learner, the person who they could be a 15-year-old, but they've already got that sense of inquiry in them, and they can be a 97-year-old truck driver for Sosimo, but they walk into a museum because they're endlessly curious, and they want a new experience that is valuable to them.
Yeah.
And if you talk in art speak, if you talk like an art historian, that's a foreign language. It's a learned foreign language. It's not my first tongue. It's a language that I learned to do over time. So I don't know if you remember the scientist who used to be up at Dartmouth College, and her name was Donella Meadows.
Oh, yes.
And she started writing an op-ed column for Norm Runyon at the Brattleboro Reformer before I got here.
Yes.
And then she continued it up to her death. And in talking to Donella once, who was this extraordinary scientist, and who saw the whole environmental system and how it fit together, and saw the political system and policy and public policy and how it fit together. And she would take a piece of that, a slice of that, and in 800 words, once a week, talk to us about it. To do that, you have to take a series of complex ideas that you know something about and get it down to no more than 800 words.
Right. Yes.
And my goal is to get it down to no more than 800 words.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pressure on that, and it's a great art to do that. This. Thank you. The focus that you've had, which is to bring art to people and to all ages and all kinds of people. And this year, 2021, you got the Peggy Cannonstein Award for Arts Advocacy, which sounded like a wonderful award because I think it dovetails so much with what you wanted to do in every endeavor you've had at the museum, but the broader art world as well. And this is the Vermont Arts Council. This is an Vermont Arts Council.
Yes, and I'm a former chairman of the Vermont Arts Council, and my dear Linda Rubenstein, colleague for decades, is a former chairman. And Peggy's she's actually a former two-time chairman of the Vermont Arts Council. But to get the Peggy Cannonstein Award, an artist, a thinker, a two-time chairman of the Arts Council, generous patron of the arts in addition to her work as a visual artist, was just very dear because I've loved Peggy for 30 years
Yes.
probably.
For many years, for 3 terms at least, you were the Senate Curatorial Advisory Committee for the
I'm
United
back
States.
on that again.
Oh, good.
I was off it, now I'm back
You're
on
back
it.
on it
But
again.
by the time Patrick Leahy steps down
Yes.
as President Pro Tem,
Yeah.
I'll be off it again.
Yes.
So
Well,
I travel with Patrick. But the interesting thing is that my term with him, then he had to step down, and his good friend Orrin Hatch stepped up.
Uh-huh.
Orrin Hatch appointed me. So I've been appointed by Patrick Leahy and Orrin Hatch.
That's wonderful.
And then I was appointed by Patrick Leahy again.
Uh-huh. That's really... In your so-called retirement coming up, I know that you're going to be really busy, Mara, with many different things, one of which is the WolfCon Foundation, of which you are the chair.
Yes, very exciting, and very, that the family voted me as the chairman to lead the start of the institution as we start the legacy portion of our endeavor. We've had a philanthropic portion,
Yes.
but we're switching to the legacy portion now.
Oh, that's very interesting. So we will keep our eyes out for that as
all
well.
very exciting.
I'll bet it is. The 50th anniversary of the museum is coming up. So I know that you're going to be the headhunter and the headliner in that, and getting people together, doing a big party. So that's something else. Anything else that you're really looking forward to?
Well, I'm looking forward to, once I get the whole 50th anniversary of the museum done, and it's a 3-part project that I'm working on. So there's the history component, and it will be a sort of dynamic timeline. It'll be online. You know, it won't be a book, but it'll be very visual, very, very visual. And so I've got to do that history and produce that history with a team of people. And we are reviving the Sterling Circle, which a group of trustees and I, for the 25th anniversary, founded the Sterling Circle, and there were a group of us who were Sterling founders, and we produced some ancillary material, and the staff of the board, the staff of the museum, has recently grown to include a professional development manager. And so now we think the time is right, not only to go back to all the trustees that served between the year 25 when I was there and the 50th now that I'm queen, to go back to all of them and say, you gave of your time, you gave of your talent, you've given of your treasure annually, you need to think about your final significant gift. Think of your family, you think of all your charitable endeavors, but please think of us kindly.
Yes.
And get them to sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, right.
And so that's another part of my portfolio of work. But probably the most fun is we've decided to do a block party.
Great.
And so I need to talk to the Renault brothers about taking over their parking lot next door to us. And I need to talk to the town about taking over the lower park below us. And I need to work and figure out who the bands are and who all the food trucks will be and who all this will be, and figure out how to get a permit for fireworks.
We know where to get them.
We know where to get them. No, but I need a permit for a professional.
Yes.
I want a professional. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah. That'll be great. Well, we look forward to that very much so.
So this, the fall of next year, will be very active at the Brattleboro Museum
Very
Art
active,
Center.
yes. Thank you, Mara, for being with us. We are looking forward to your next years and the many, many things that you're going to be doing, starting with this party, which we can't wait for, which is going to be so exciting. So that's fall next year. And I'm so glad that you came on the show.
Well, I very much appreciate your having me.
Thanks to all of you for being with us today and for listening to Mara Williams, who is many years at the Brattleboro Museum Art Center here in town, and she's going to be continuing on with lots of different projects. So we will stay tuned to what she's going to be up to and what the museum's going to be up to, and hopefully you'll be stay tuned to what we're going to be up to here at Brattleboro Community Television. Thanks so much for joining us today.